Let's go. I think that should work.
We'll fix this in post.
We'll fix it in post. I'm not doing it. I'll hire someone.
Hello, there we go. Hi, so I spent the train ride this morning trying to think of what the best gender-neutral greeting for everyone would be, and I think I am sleep-addled, so what I came up to was hello, snacks. Welcome to Queer versus Gay Storytelling. We are going to be talking about world building and actual play dramaturgy. I wanted to open with a question to you all as a show of hands. Who knows what dramaturgy is? Hell yeah. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, it is a profession, a role in theater that is around the analysis of dramatic composition of a piece of work, literature, or the play. And so a dramaturg's job is to ask questions of the playwright and the director, being like, what is this theme? And followed up with, why? And so this is something we'll be examining today. So for the purposes of this panel, we wanted to set up a dichotomy between gay versus queer. For the purposes of the day, we will talk about gay as wholesome, sexy, normalizing. The lens is for heteronormativity and acceptance because of sameness. This is work that plays by the rules of a heteronormative society. Whereas queer, we want to focus on liberation, kink, things that are maybe dirtier. This is a deviation from the norm that demands to be accepted despite its differences. And that's the dichotomy we're working with today. And with that in mind, let me introduce you all to these lovely queers. Or rather, let me let them introduce themselves. So let's go down the line. I can model for you all if you like. Oh, no, you go first, actually.
Hello everyone, I'm Josephine at Scary Dog Friend. My pronouns are none or she. You can find me online, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, Blue Sky, Scary Dog Friend. My favorite piece of queer media is The Handmaiden.
Hi, my name is Fabian, at Rockets and Pens. You can find me everywhere at Rockets and Pens or at BadHouseTTRPG. We co-produce a lot of queer, weird horror APs. I guess my favorite piece of queer media, Why the Last Man, both in comic form and live action adaptation.
Hello. I am Fish. You can find me all over the interwebs as FishFinlee. I'm a digital artist. I go by they, she pronouns. I'm a digital artist and live play performer, and I'm on the board for the Crit Awards. My favorite piece of gay queer media, I feel like I've just been asked what my favorite song is, and my brain is going completely blank, so we're just going to name what my favorite piece of media is because there is a lot of gay and queer content in it, and I love it very much. Doctor Who, love it to pieces.
Hi, I'm Russ, or RK. I go by RussWildest online everywhere. I use they, them pronouns. And once again, also, the song thing, I can't remember anything. So the most recent one, Interview with a Vampire.
Hello, everybody. I am a decorated officer, leader of House Kierman. No. Hi, I'm Dan Pyxel. They, them. I am a Let's Play streamer and actual play performer. Oh goodness, I've forgotten the rest of it already.
What's your favorite piece of gay or queer media?
Oh, Life is Strange. 100%. And every year it just keeps getting gayer and gayer.
And welcome everyone. I am John Johnson. You can find me on Blue Sky at John. I am gender non-compliant and gender anarchist, so whatever pronouns you want to take. And my favorite piece of gay or queer media, I'll be like a bit of a slut, and I'll say Baldur's Gate 3. And so, welcome, thank you all for being here today on a lovely, potentially hungover Sunday on the final day of PaxU. Thank you all for your attendance. So we're going to dive right in. I will be facilitating a few questions, but we'll keep it pretty free-flowing, and then there'll be Q&A afterwards. So if you have burning questions, you know, even in the middle of it a little bit, like raise your hand if it's like really itching you. We'll get you to the mic and we'll have the talk, right? But for now, we'll dive right in. So the first question is to the panel at large. Whomever feels like jumping in first, it will be, how does queerness appear in our cultures, and how is it erased? And secretly, if you hadn't noticed, we're all Asian. So how does queerness appear in our culture? Oh, I know, surprise! But how does queerness appear in our cultures, and how is it erased?
Colonialism. That's like how it was So I'm South Asian. My family comes from India, and a lot of the queerness, like being gay, was pretty normalized before the British came through and started doing what they do. And a lot of things were erased, destroyed, and then Christianity and missionaries showed up and started saying, no, being whatever religion you are, because everyone thinks India is just Hindus. There's so many more regions and languages than you might think. At one point, because India originally was like, I think it was 150 different tribes that were basically told, no, you're one group now.
Just gonna really quick segue from that really quick. I'm a bit of a linguistics nerd. It's really cool. If you ever want to know just how diverse India is, look into the languages that are present there, because they're from entirely different language families. Like they're from entirely different like connections. Like they're not all the same at all, even if like the Western world likes to kind of lump them together. Anyway.
No, you're really right. That's another thing that I love about India. And so yeah, the colonialism happened, and all of that culture and history was erased. So much so that like temples and things that depicted them were often defaced or destroyed to hide what was originally there. So yeah, that's how it affected my culture and where my family is from.
Yeah. And kind of where we see, and very similarly to Korean culture and like the years of occupation from America and Japan, where we see queerness being depicted nowadays is just giant repression like storylines where it's like if we just pretend this for this amount of time and we stay married and we look a certain way, or at the very end of The Handmaiden, sorry for the spoiler, but I'll try to wrap it up super quick, is that the main getaway is to appear to be a straight couple escaping to China. So yeah, it is certainly one of those things where it's just like you can't even actually be yourself throughout the entire timeline.
To kind of jump off of that, I actually just got back from a trip to India, so I was very surrounded by family and the expectations that my culture holds. And I'm a very aromantic, asexual person. And unfortunately, that means that I will never live up to the expectations of having a family in the way that colonialism has kind of defined. And it was really interesting going back to India because I was going for a cousin's wedding, and so there was a lot of like rituals and images and like facades that everyone wanted to hold up, and it was very odd trying to, especially since I've like discovered this part about myself, trying to pretend that I wasn't and pretend like there was a chance that I could have a family in that way, and just so that like the facade could be maintained. And it's something that I see cropping up both. It's something that I have to deal with very directly with Desi culture, but like I see it in like my friends and family and my friends trying to deal with like how they interact with their cultures as well. Of like their identity is such a like crucial like core point to who they are and how they are in their friendships and in the places where they feel loved and accepted. And so when they have to kind of try to interact with their culture, which is something that you can't ever really get rid of, like your culture is your culture, like you want to connect with what makes you you, but if you have to kind of give up part of your queerness in order to be able to do that, that sucks and is such a like really weighty thing to have to wade through. And that was an interesting thing I had to kind of cope with over the past week and a half, is like, how do I be outwardly and openly queer and still have a relationship with all of these extended family members and have a relationship with this culture that I've grown up in and love and am a part of.
I think apart from colonialism, just to be more specific, I grew up in the Philippines, so I'm a late bloomer. I came out like much later in life, and I think Catholicism is one of like Christianity. You can like religion is a huge proponent on like oppression and just silencing who you really are. I grew up in like to have a good education, you had to go to these private schools that were segregated by gender. And it was bad if you were gay or if you were a little queer or anything, and it kind of like beat into my brain that's like, if I was like this, I wouldn't be accepted anywhere. You know, even my friends who I came out to had like a, not necessarily a hard time, but like it took them time to kind of like wrap around the fact that like, you know, I was bi, and then later, like a lot later, like, you know, like non-binary. So these things generally just kind of make it hard for you to explore yourself because of colonization. Obviously, the Philippines, it's hard to date back. When is the earliest queer evidence of queer storytelling, or like anything queer for that matter, because of all the destruction that colonization did to our history. But it's nice to finally break away from that and find myself in the communities like this. So yeah.
Boop, boop, there we go. And lastly, I grew up in Malaysia, which not only had the colonization from the British, but is also a very conservative Islamic state. And so, like, when Born This Way came out, they like banned it. They were like, no queer acceptance, absolutely not. We will ban this song because it is too promoting of a gay lifestyle. But then, you know, coming to the States, it became a lot about like, oh, I have the sort of bandwidth now to seek what is authentic to me, and how can I be what I feel whenever I want to. Not necessarily that I have to confine myself to whatever decisions to make, but I can really drink that gender fluid whenever I want, you know? Like I'm a frat bro at a party, I would chug it. And like, but the interesting thing about Malaysia, like Dan, you might remember, Dan and I were slated to do a show about Hang Tuah, which is like one of our national heroes. And Hang Tuah had his closest companion, they were roommates, Hang Jebat, right? And like, when we look at the dramaturgy of that story, right, the dramatic composition, they are actually positioned similarly to, I don't know, a topical like Alphaba and Glinda. You know, though that role might not be explicitly gay, but their positionality in the story is one that signifies a form of romance. Not necessarily sexual, not necessarily romantic, but romance, and that this is an intimate connection. And so there are several scholars that look back at the national hero of Malaysia being like, he gay. Like, Hang Jebat thought Hang Tuah died and went on a rampage murdering everyone. We're like, there's nothing gayer than that. So, which is where we get the term amok. He ran amok. But yeah, so that is, did we miss anyone about queerness and culture?
Mine ties into the next question,
yeah,
so I'm gonna, like, because I'm a diaspora child, I'm very American, so for me, like, looking at this is gonna tie into, like, the next question is that, what American culture, because of both religion and colonialism, asks you to be one thing and one thing only, and so being both queer and Asian is like one of those things where it's like, you just feel it being sanded down constantly, where it's like, you can only be one thing, you have to make this decision about what you're going to be so we can identify you and put you in a little box. And it's, you know, in some way it makes it so difficult to explore that connection if you only get one choice. But thankfully, like, there are spaces like this one that I am on right here, and I have been at tables where there have been so many other queer and Asian players, GMs, where it's like, oh my God, this is, that is no longer this dichotomy that I am forced into.
Would you like to segue that into the next question, which is, what is the intersection of your Asian identity and your queer identity?
Sure. Like, I'm in the same way as in this country, it's like I'm othered in every room I walk into, and finding the pride in that took me like very, very long. Like, I really only feel like I have been myself in the last couple of years through this space in a large way, because this space is so free and accepting in a lot more ways than other arts spaces even are. Like, John and I are theater people. We worked in the same professional theater circles for a very long time. And even though theater is like, we are a queer bastion, if you're a gay white man, and finding the ways through that in the space where it's like, we are not bound by that anymore. Like, we get to be whatever kind of queer characters we want to be in spaces we create ourselves. So for me, it is always now getting to choose to be both constantly and loudly.
To tell my truth, Dan, I feel like I would not have been super proud about being Korean, period, if it were not for Korean queer people and like being able to realize that like 1 + 2 can also be like whatever. Like, yeah, like if I hadn't met as many Korean queer people in this space, or just like other like just broader like diasporic like Asian identities and things like that, like I probably would have been like identifying, misaligning myself with communities that like I obviously don't want to be around now. The intersection very much there is that, I mean, the biggest kind of harkening back to like Christianity is like the biggest problem was that like Korean people and Christian people were the same thing to me growing up, and it's like there is like a very disheartening cultural like thing that gets taken away from me when we go to Korea and we see the like mounded altars of our dead, and my parents like pulled me up from like bowing to the altar and being like, oh, we don't actually do that, and it's like, okay, interesting, this is what is being erased, this is like what I am like actively losing by not being able to participate in this. So there's so many more like little moments of that just like in everyday American life. But yeah, like it's very much the intersection of that and all those things is that like it is such a beautiful, like brilliant, like gay life that is also in Korea, and being able to bring that into my life as an American now, as like someone that tells stories, like it's all possible because you can will it to be. Yeah.
Kind of to jump off of that, I've experienced the world in binaries. Like growing up, I went to a private Christian school. My family is Hindu. My parents are immigrants from India, so for my entire life it was very much you can either be American or you can be Indian. You have to either kind of pick a side and then run with it. And so I ended up kind of being as Americanized as possible because the route that my parents took in raising me and my brother was very much the route of if you are as Americanized as possible, they can't reject you, and this can be your home. And now that I'm an adult, and now that I have the chance to kind of explore adulthood, I only very recently came out as being non-binary, and I got to explore my asexuality in college, so I got to kind of get in touch with my queerness very like around my like early adulthood. It was like the first time that I got to see that like maybe I don't have to pick between like one side or the other. Maybe I get to kind of like be what I am, and so instead of like you were saying, Heather, like every it feels like every kind of group has an image of what like the ideal queer is, and or like the ideal person is, and that differs from culture to culture. And so again, in experiencing the world in binaries, what I ended up getting was like there's the American image of like the ideal queer person, and then there's the Indian image of like the ideal daughter, and then there's like there's so many like examples of like images and expectations of what you're meant to be, and they differ so vastly, and being kind of caught in the middle of these different binaries is super interesting because it gets really difficult to pick, and you don't realize you don't have to pick until you get into spaces like this with other people who decided that like, hey, I don't have to pick, I can sit right in the middle of this road and no one can tell me otherwise. I only figured out I was ace because I met another Asian who was ace. I only figured out I was non-binary because I met another Asian who was non-binary. I only got the chance to explore these identities because the TTRPG space allowed me to connect with people who were kind of sharing these identities with me, and decided not to pick, and decided to be an example for other people that went, hey, you may be seeing the world as two choices. There's a secret third choice, and that is do whatever the frick you want. And it's really difficult to take that lane, but it's so freeing because it means that you can be yourself unapologetically, and the world can just eat it.
I think that's a big thing for my sort of intersection. Grew up in a Christian household. My parents are also immigrants from India, first generation American, and growing up, I was very like by the book, follow the rules, don't break anything. And then at a certain point I went absolutely fucking hog wild and started breaking every rule. And then I had a moment where I was like, maybe this is not what I need to do. Maybe I can look at both of the paths that have been placed before me, like you said, and instead of being like pick one or the other, I can take all of them and accept the bits that I want and get rid of the bigotry and the other pieces that aren't a part of who I am and aren't a part of what I deserve, and the type of love and community and companionship that I want to have. With specifically like Asian cultures, there's a major focus on community and the family versus individuality. And there's stuff I love about that, but there's also stuff I hate about that, because there is this inherent patriarchy of not being able to question elders or parents or your father, et cetera, and I think that questioning those elements and being like, which of these works for me, which of these doesn't, has helped me build a better view of myself and the type of world and life I would like to live in.
I think it's, for me, the intersectionality of my career identity and me as an Asian person. I think it differs between most of the panelists, where a lot of my experiences is going through life through a lens that has been rewritten by, colonialism and religion, and these stories that I grew up with are so heteronormative, and then now going into a space that opens up and discovers that, hey, there are queer undertones to these stories that you grew up with. And then you start to realize that you discover yourself through these, you start to see yourself through the lens of these, and even in fictional or non-fictional stories. Like, you're telling me that, the resistance against the Spanish, all of these men were cooped up together and none of them were queer? You've gotta be kidding me. So it's really nice to be able to start and rediscover these roots and start to see that whatever these things that were erased, that were just chopped off from history, and you can relate to them, and that you can feel comfortable to know that you're just as normal as everybody else. That's basically where the intersectionality goes. I don't know if, John, you growing in Malaysia, I don't know if you had the same experience of history books being rewritten to kind of just depict the machismo of whatever resistance is against.
Very much
Very much so.
Yeah, so.
Well, I don't want to segue that actually to a question to the audience. Can you think for a moment about a piece of media that you like, and there is a character that is sexuality unspecified but assumed to be the default cishet straight? Has anyone ever seen one of those characters and been like, nah, that's Fan, nah, that's one of us, right? It's those queer undertones we talk about, and often, like I said before, with Glinda Alphaba, they just have positionality in the story and what roles they serve, and so there's also a bit about what role does queerness play in our lives as well.
And it's just funny because recently, Arcane, I don't know if anybody has watched the whole thing.
That's not. Just we have to jump in.
We're not gonna spoil it, but the fact that the creator themselves are Jason, Victor aren't queer. Are you blind? It's just funny that people depict these characters and they don't realize that they're queer undertones.
Well, so for season 1, right? I'll give this
Yeah,
specific.
not just for season 1 alone.
They are so queer, but also I remember the guy with the bat ears, and he
Scar.
briefly looks at Echo, and I'm like, that's gay. No lines, that's gay. Instantly, because I'm we know, we can tell, oh look, in this glance there is yearning, there is care and affection that goes beyond broness, okay, right? So I think those undertones pop up a lot, and that's why particularly queer folks, gay folks, everyone in the alphabet mafia, we latch onto it because we, for the longest time, have been so starved of representation outside of, say, a Rocky Horror Picture Show, right? We had so few examples in mainstream media that when they pop up, we go, ooh, that's ours. And so I think that does segue into my next question. I want to poke Fish first. Because Fish, could you talk to me a little bit about the stories about the group versus the stories that we choose to tell?
Yeah, so I as a South Asian, let me tell you, I spent my entire life trying to imprint myself on characters in media, and none of them were South Asian. Either they weren't South Asian and they had vaguely melanated skin and I went that me, or they were South Asian in the butt of every single joke. And unfortunately, that is a trope that continues to this day. But what that resulted in is it resulted in me being really hyper aware of when South Asians were telling stories about South Asian culture versus when other people were telling stories about South Asian culture, because it becomes very, very clear, very, very immediately what part of that culture they think is important, and it does not line up. Like the group that's being told stories about thinks different things are important about themselves than what the outside looks on it and sees. So like with specifically, and you feel free to chime in as you see, but like with specifically with South Asian culture, with like media that shows that, say like Never Have I Ever, the Netflix show. I, hot take, hate it so much. I have yet to meet a friend of mine who is South Asian who likes it because it feels very like, hey guys, we've got a very stereotypically strict dad and a kid who's just doing their best in school, who plays instruments and is trying to find their way, and rebelling against their very strict Indian family, and it just felt very like cookie cutter stereotype. It's like, as a Desi, it's like I know what the parts of my culture that I think are important are more of like how families come together and stay together in ways that like are generational. Like my grandparents live in multi-generational households where their kids and their kids' kids and their kids' kids' kids all stay in the same house together, and they all help support each other, and they all like help guide each other through life and pass on family recipes and stuff like that. Whereas this like stereotype of like the strict family and the good grades and the like, I don't know, like it becomes very, very clear when stuff is being told about a culture, because it clarifies what the storyteller thinks is important about that culture, and that can sometimes be really, really damaging if they're not from that culture and not yeah, this sentence is getting away from me, but hopefully the point made across.
So I haven't watched that show on Netflix, but I think of a specific example of like, not a main character, but a side character. And most of you probably know this character, a character from Phineas and Ferb, Baljeet. He is a stereotype. He is a kind of like pretty offensive stereotype most of the time, where the only thing he ever cares about is grades, impressing his parents, and it's a children's show, yes, but it is still very clear to me watching that and seeing that as a kid and being like, he looks like me, but he's not for me. He's meant to be the butt of every joke, like you said. He's meant to be the kid who gets bullied a lot. He's meant to not be anything more than the good student who occasionally shows up. And I do agree that like, you can tell the difference between the stories that people who are from those cultures create and people who aren't from those cultures create. I think about all the beautiful games and worlds that I've seen that have been own voice worlds, and the different focuses on culture and like the different pieces of your world. I played in a game with a friend a while back, and there was such an importance on food in that game. And the description of it was always so vivid that you could always tell that she was pulling from her memory, and she was pulling from her own culture and everything. And that's been something that's happened in my game. So a lot of the taverns in my world don't serve classic meat, potatoes. They serve roti canai, they serve like other different meals that are representative of the culture that I'm from, that I've had her serve like egg roast masala, like things that are from my culture that I know and I love and are pieces of me, and they show up in those stories, even in minor ways.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there isn't like a seedling of truth in that sort of stereotype. The issue is that when someone who is not from that group is telling that story, sometimes what happens is there's an overemphasis placed on those parts of the story. Like, yeah, my parents were super strict growing up about grades, but that wasn't my whole personality. That wasn't their whole personality. There was so much more to that. And there's so much criticisms that can be made about the culture as well without buying into and feeding into these really harmful stereotypes as well. It's so complex, and I feel like it's very hard to capture that complexity if you're talking about a story that isn't yours.
I actually have to springboard off that a little bit, because there are so many characters that it's like, when I was growing up, there was not good Asian representation anywhere. Every Asian character was written almost entirely by white people. And then even amongst that, there's like, one of my favorite characters of all time is Cassandra Cain Batgirl, who is a mixed Asian character, was created in the year 2000 by two straight dudes. And over time, Cassandra Cain has been a character that queer Asians have latched onto and slowly pulled her away from these stereotypes where it's like, when she first appeared, she didn't speak. She was just really good at martial arts and she didn't know how to speak. And over like the years, we've changed so much about her, pulling her away from this ridiculous negative stereotype that now she is officially like the official Batgirl of DC again as of this year. Yeah. Orphan, yeah. Yeah, Orphan, like the Orphan persona was like, when they did like a reboot, they went back to this like, she can't speak, she can't read, and it's like, hey, don't do that. We fought so hard to get her here, and it's only been like in the last year that she's finally back as Batgirl, and it's like, finding those characters and then fighting for them, because until we, run a coup takeover and then are producing all the art ourselves, like, we've got to fight that, and yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is a great distinction for me in gay versus queer, again, this dichotomy that we're working with, because I often feel like gay represents pride, right? Like both in like, we are here, we are, we celebrate, etc. Let's all be like ripped and sexy on parade floats. But I think one of the things that queerness excites within me in particular is the really gross and gritty sense of wrath, what we have to fight for, what we have to struggle through, both externally with the pressures of the world and internally with the pressures that we place upon ourselves. And so, but also like queerness in this way is also more expansive, because I think a lot of gay literature, gay media is centered around romance and sexuality. It's like, who is this character smooching? And that's so important to gayness, because we want that physical and visual representation. But queerness is so much more than that. So I wanted to move to the next questions, starting with Josephine and opening up to the group. But in the idea that queerness is more expansive, how does aceness and arrowness show up in your work and in your storytelling?
So fellow arrow ace over here. Yeah, very much so. Like, we at BadHouseTTRPG, we tell like erotic stories. We tell erotic like thrillers. But even in that, there is still like an eroticism, or stories about eroticism also can relate to and have everything to do with like sexual repression, or like certain sexual stories that still relate to like ace and arrow people's relationship to sex, their own sexuality, kink, how sex is used, sex work, and all of those things. So how it specifically shows up is just proving ever more that like there is not just platonic and romantic and sexual relationships. There's also alterous relationships, alterous attraction being that like middle ground, or this even greater, ever expanding thing between romantic, platonic, and other types of attraction. It's just a type of attraction that like has no words that we actually have or know. I prefer it over queer platonic, because smashing two words together can get us so far for a very long time. But we play with vampires. So the deep bonding, like soul crushing, like feelings of vampires that they have because they're dead creatures, blood bonding with someone, or siring someone, hypnotizing someone in whatever ways that these can be metaphors for. Certainly there's, a lot of horrible, like non-consensual things that can come alongside the magic of vampires. But being two dead queer people together, bonded by your blood, or tasting each other's blood, and that not necessarily being a sexual drive for each other, but an undying loyalty, a friendship that lasts forever. And also, vampires have no blood in their, body parts, so it's also like hugging is very difficult, or eating food is very difficult for each other. So vampires, it's a come and go kind of thing, depending on what you go for. But when we think of vampires, we think of devotion, for example, and that doesn't necessarily have to be sexual devotion or stuff like that.
I also want to kind of like piggyback off of one of Josephine's characters in one of our campaigns. I think apart from it choosing who you want to be with is in the antagonistic light, fighting against people who want to put you in a position and sexualize you without your consent. Like it is very cathartic to be able to break away. There was a moment where a sire wanted them for one thing, but it actually was another. And their character was able to break away and have albeit a short, actual platonic or somewhat could be perceived as a romantic relationship with another character. And it was a beautiful story to tell, to be able to say that like I choose who I want to be with and I choose what life I want to live. So it's just as important in queer storytelling to be able to be yourself and in any facet, whether it's romance or professional life of a character. That's something that we value. So.
I'm actually gonna piggyback off that as well. I really love that we brought our Asianness into this conversation because it was such an important part of me figuring out that I was Arrow Ace. I had this really wonderful conversation with my mom over the past week where we were talking about friendships that I have and how me being Arrow Ace doesn't necessarily mean that I'm missing out on deep connections with people in my life. And my mom was really struggling to understand that because in her head it was very much like you have a romantic partner or you have a sexual partner and they're usually the same person. And then you have friends and your friends, their platonic relationships are so much more distant than the closest you have with your romantic or sexual partner. And to her, she was really trying to wrap her head around the fact that I feel very thoroughly fulfilled with the friendships in my life and with the deep connections that I've made with the people in my life, even though they aren't romantic or sexual, because you can get so much depth out of a human connection and it doesn't have to be sexual or romantic in any way. And being part of the TTRPG space has been a freaking blessing because not only have I been able to meet more queer people, but I've been able to meet other queer people who also value that deep, just human connection outside of the romantic and sexual things. And because I like to say I'm the most flamboyantly Arrow Ace person on the planet because here's the thing, being Ace, being Arrow, it's a spectrum. There's a lot of different variations thereupon, and anywhere on that spectrum is valid. Anywhere on that spectrum is valid. I'm, however, sitting at the way far end at the back going, hey guys, how's it going? Because my answer to any question is no. And I feel like what that results in is the way that I see all of my relationships is that's just a layer that's not present for me. It needs to be very specifically pointed out for me by the other people in my life who maybe do experience sexual and romantic attraction, but that's even there because in my head it's just these are just human connections that I'm forming with people. These are my friends, these are my life, soulmates, through TTRPGs, through just anything. It's like a whole other layer of human connection that I feel like I'm kind of living in, that sometimes gets completely overlooked or mistaken for sexual and romantic attraction, and that's completely not it.
Yeah, and honestly, as someone who isn't Arrow Ace, one thing that I did learn from people who are is sexuality is a form of intimacy, but also loyalty is something that is very intimate. To give someone your full being, if not physically, somewhat emotionally, to make sure that you are behind that person on their choices, that's some form of intimacy that is very important to a lot of people. So I think that's also just as important, and it doesn't have to veer into eroticism or sexuality. So.
Would you die for someone?
That is so important. That's so intimate.
Yeah. And part, I think one last thing I want to say about this topic is that you don't realize just how much of society has decided to revolve themselves around sexual and romantic attraction until you stop engaging with it entirely. Because then you're sitting there going like, what do you mean this is coming up every other conversation? I just don't want to deal with it.
I think this is an ongoing conversation, I think, in a lot of queer circles about the nature of labels, like when are they useful and when are they not. Like, you mentioned queer platonic earlier, which is a term I love because it is so nebulous and limited. You know, so I say it to the outside and people have their assumption of it, but then in my queer platonic relationships, we know it's so much more nuanced than that. You know, the label is for the soup can, but we know the ingredients, you know, so like that sort of thing. And one of the things I like to explore in TTRPGs, I have a running gag that anytime I GM or DM someone who gives me an orphan, I add another parent to my character's backstory. And so like I build these little backstories with big family units coming from like sort of pre-settler colonialism, pre-industrial revolution times built around that family unit. And one of the things I explore is that what their romantic attraction and sexual attraction is actually irrelevant to the fact that they're a family unit in that moment. And it's really important to me to explore. And so like, you know, I don't have, so case in point to a podcast I'm on called Moon Harbor Heroes. My character is from a post-apocalyptic future, and this is the only TTRPG character I play that has a heteronormative pairing as parenthood. And so like, dramaturgy, right? Does anyone else want to talk more about asexuals, or can I move on? Yeah, absolutely, go for it. Oh, okay, cool. So let's talk about what are some explorations of queerness that you have done in your work? Queerness being much broader now, coming back up from the ASER to whatever you need queer to mean.
For me specifically, I got into the actual play space about, I want to say, 2.5 years ago-ish. And that was my first chance to really dig into the TTRPGs and play with people who kind of knew how to tell stories and really knew how to build characters with intricate and meaningful backstories and how to create worlds in that way. And at the time, I knew I was ace. I didn't know I was arrow. I didn't know I was non-binary. I was just kind of like, you know what? Sex isn't for me. Cool. Moving on. And I got to play all these wonderful stories, and I got to watch the people around me engage with these pieces of their identity, like with their gender identity, with their romantic identity, and it was just kind of like watching all that inspired me to start doing that myself. So within a lot of the actual plays that I performed in, I started exploring with pronouns. I started playing characters that had different sexualities, different romantic identities, and at some point I landed where I was as a person, because I had the opportunity to explore that through my work, like through the performances that I was doing, through the shows that I was performing in. It was a chance, it was a stage for me to see what it felt like to wear those shoes, so to speak, and figure out what shoes felt comfortable. And then that way when I got off the stage, I was like, oh, this is me, this is where I stand, this is where I am. And it also helped me understand how the queerness, how my friends are and how my friends interact with their queerness. Because like I am one small person in this vast world. There are so many different associations and identities and combinations thereupon that I will never feel that I fit into. But the friends in my life, the people in my life absolutely fit into, and it helped me understand what queerness looks like to other people, to be able to engage with this in the actual plays and the live performances.
Yeah. This dips into a little bit of the next question, but I feel like it all kind of comes together. So we work a lot with supernatural creatures and World of Darkness and things like that. I feel like if I got the opportunity to actually enjoy being a little girl, like if everyone made it their business to make being a little girl the worst thing in the world. I played a young girl, a Samitsi, a shape-shifting sort of vampire. I feel like if I were just able to change my bones and my face and give myself blood horns and giant arms and shadow powers or magic, I'd be so happy being cis. You know what I mean? There's something with a body that has no limits too. It's a body that experiences pain, and there's so many ways that you can explore chronic disabilities and things like that. There is still the hunger of the blood and all of those things, and this desire for loyalty. But like, there is the fun exploration of queerness there is just that like, it's this girl who just got to love it, just got to love being who she was.
Talking about the exploration of queerness, just a general question. How many people have played a TTRPG character throwing a pronoun and going, oh no, this is something? So that's how it started, being non-binary started for me. I played a TTRPG character and went, oh no, I like this a lot. This is me now. But looking at other aspects of my identity, I have been in a campaign of a TTRPG campaign for over 7 years. We've had 152 sessions of that game as of last week. And through the process of that game, my character, my PC, has had a slow burn romance over those 7 years. And it has been one of the most, it has been like crack cocaine for my brain when it comes to exploring romance and those feelings and like, what does romance truly look like to me and to those around me. And it's so fun sitting with your GM and being like, are they gonna kiss yet? No.
Yeah, and like to build up that, like creating characters and discovering yourself through them. John actually probably remembers this very well. We had a multi-year Western Marches campaign in which we all had like multiple characters and rotating GMs and stuff. And like my first character was actually an exploration as I was like moving through with him. He was cis, but he was ace arrow. And that's one of the things with the exploration that the tabletop allows is like, I discovered through that it's like, this worked really well with this character, but it is also not something that is my label. It is not something that I identify with. And so then my next character was Panafolk and was he/they non-binary, and that was sort of like interesting. And then my next character was a bisexual disaster rogue, because that's what you do with rogues, at least for your first ones. And that was and Seren was a cis woman, and then like over time I was like, oh wait a minute, hold on a minute. And then as a bit of a tangent to that, like there was also an NPC that I created in that campaign. I told the story yesterday, where I created an 8-foot-tall giant ASMR woman, and I didn't have a lot of like background for some of things. And then John was telling me years later, it's like, oh yeah, like you built the Arbiter as a giant lesbian, didn't you? You giant lesbian. And I was like, wait, no, I didn't. Did everyone just know before I did?
Dan built Dame Island before Dame Island existed, and then when this character popped up, I was like, oh, lesbian, right? And then so playing the game, we had this giant angel woman with a bit like paladin. I was like, that's a lesbian.
It's always the tall butch.
Sorry?
It's always the tall butch.
And she wasn't very much. She was actually quite femme. She was, but I was just like,
Even better.
yeah,
The
this was
Yu-Gi-Oh card mystical elf, like that was the sort of like visual basis I had for her.
I feel this in my soul though, because like when I came up with non-binary, I was like telling friends, I was like, here's the patch update, guys, here's my new pronouns, and they were like, new? And I was like, what? And they were like, I mean, congratulations! And I was like, where was this memo? How did I miss it? What? So I feel it in my soul.
I was just like, I've got red for Phil, and y'all just didn't tell me for years.
I will say though, I did feel very seen.
We got a question over there? Yeah, come on up to the mic. Hello.
Hello.
Is it on? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Twine. Everyone say thank you, Twine. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering something, that the elements of queer versus gay storytelling that you talked about, the queer storytelling being transgressive and rebellious, like Eat the Reich and Extreme Meat Punks Forever and stuff like that, and gay storytelling being something more of the community trying to meet the status quo where the status quo is at. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if those elements kind of, through the expression of those elements, are there unforeseen limitations to the kinds of stories we can tell in those spaces? Like, for example, can you tell a queer story without a dominant socio-economical political structure that intrinsically oppresses people?
Yes.
Yes.
I also want to point out super secretly, right, like, so much of what we're talking about is about breaking binary systems, and I have presented you a binary system. So like part of the queerness of that is what is the nuance in between? If I presented two options, what are the third and fourth? And now I pass to you.
I was going to say, so we're talking about, can you have a queer story without having an oppression in the story? Yes, because the audience is in the society that has the oppression. So even seeing a world without it, you are envisioning an imagined utopia of what life could be that the audience has to then reconcile against the world they live in. There is the challenge of being someone who can see the future, who can see what the world could be a better place and how great things could be, but knowing where we are now. It is a big thing of activism of like, don't focus always on the terrible, you have to think about where we could be and how do we get there. Otherwise you will burn yourself out.
And to piggyback on that is wonderful, like, yeah, that's exactly, yes. There's a second part that is not just about like the narrative being something that has to exist under the oppression and like we as outside meta. There's also the world building itself, right? Without getting into too many spoilers, like Arcane is a show that I think skates that line really carefully, in which the way that it is mostly transgressive comes from the way that it defies tropes and conventions of storytelling in a otherwise what would be considered a gay narrative, becomes queer by the actions of subverting all the literary and narrative things that the conventions even, not just tropes, but the conventions, the way that we tell a story. Doing something new is inherently transgressive. And even if it is smaller than being widely unique, it still is pushing against that kind of oppression, if that makes sense.
Thank you for your question.
Mine doesn't light up. So, what are some other explorations of queerness? We've touched on a few, but what other explorations of queerness do you like to touch in your work or explore in your work?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just reading something. Can you read the question?
Any explorations of queerness in your work, either in AP or home?
I mean, there's a lot, but everybody touched upon like things that I would also touch upon. I know we have like limited time, and in case like other people want to like ask questions, I would rather open the floor to them or like other questions that we have on the list.
Yeah, then you can find us over by the horse statue afterwards. We'll feel some more, we'll be happy to just chat with you. But does anyone have any questions you wanted to pose to the panel while we still have some time and while you have our wonderful microphone voices so you don't have to yell all over the convention?
Please go and form a line.
Yeah, please use the microphone or project if you feel so inclined, whatever moves you.
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm sure someone coming late. Apologies. We're really excited to be here to see this. I know you talked about having identities explored that you discovered that were sort of a part of you later on. Are there any cases where, coming from me, I'm very solid my identity happened. I'm like 30 now. I've never had any kind of crisis, but I do really enjoy exploring identities that aren't mine and kind of getting a taste of what that would be like to understand my friends and family better. Is there any examples that you have of that that kind of stand out? Sorry.
No, please don't apologize. That's a lovely question. I think I can give like a weird kind of example a little bit where I was in a long-term D&D campaign over the lockdown where theatrical fiction was D&D reality, so we all played people from various like movies and plays. And I ended up in a romance with a character, and the player was straight. I was like, I'm straight, You know, and then over time, come September, right? Yeah, there's just this little admission in the Discord that's like, guys, I think I'm bisexual. And I was like, you nearly drove 10 hours just to smooch me on the forehead in person. Is that straight? Right? And so like that sort of exploration occurs, and then like I think for us it's important, like Dan and I coming from theater, we've played so many characters that aren't inherently us, but we develop that sense of empathy to find like those parts that do align, what resonates, you know? And so when we're playing characters, it's not always, this is me, but gayer. This is me and parts of me that I want to try on, like almost like personality clothing. What shoes fit, I think was a great metaphor earlier. Or what styles fit, you know? And I think that's a great way to explore and cultivate an empathy for others.
So there's part of you in every character, kind of.
Always a little part, but stuff I want to see, like what if? Like what if this version of John was like, I don't know, stupid?
and actually, John can never be stupid. John is the mastermind, so many things. But to go off that, like from the theater world, one of the things that like I've seen a lot of directors try to give advice to straight actors trying to play queer, which is like getting them through the gay lens, which is like they're not different to you, right? Which is like something that sometimes you have to like drag them by like kicking and screaming across the finish line to understand. In some ways, it's like if you do something transgressive and turn it back around in the same way, like there are things that are inherent to us as queer people that now it's like, oh, I see straight people do that too. And if you put it through that way when you build a character, you might find something to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi. My friends and I have a D&D group, and we have 2 queer players, myself and a woman, plus some people who are ace, non-binary, etc. Our dungeon master is cishet. And we were talking this morning about the idea of, integrating more queer characters into how we play, and he was very concerned. Not because he doesn't want to do it, but he said, well, I don't have that experience. I'm a cis male. I wouldn't want to run into presenting things as a stereotype. What are some tips you can suggest to someone in this idea of queer storytelling, maybe that hasn't walked the walk, shall we say, to be able to put themselves into those shoes to better flesh out the world that they actually believe in as well?
Collaborate on the NPCs together. Yeah,
Okay.
like even providing media touchdowns to be like, we want to experience this type of person because it's related to my backstory in this way. And if you have to hold their hand through a little bit of it, sometimes things happen. But like, there's no reason that the characters are not also writers in your game. Yeah.
I would also posit, so this is always a shock to people, I don't like safe spaces. I want brave and accountable spaces. And so what I want for your GM, your DM, is to be like, you are going to go into this making mistakes, but everyone at the table can then talk it through and say, hey, this is why it's a mistake. That way the education occurs, and that also leads to the cultivation of empathy. So I encourage you all as a group, because you are already a group there, tight-knit and intimacy is there, so build that accountable space, so that way your DM knows he can mess up, still be forgiven for it, and learn from it.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You talked once about Batgirl, and I know nothing about this, but that whole story of about a character that was originally straight edge and pretty stereotypical and pretty uninteresting, and then slowly taken back by queer media, and to become more identifiable, more approachable, more unique. And then suddenly going back and then for some remake being given back the original stereotype and being really upset about it. It sounds familiar and it sounds familiar and like something that has happened many times before. And do you have any other examples of stuff that has happened like that?
I think one of the most perfect examples is Harley Quinn from Suicide Squad to Harley Quinn Birds of Prey and back to the Suicide Squad. The first Suicide Squad was written through the male gaze of let's just over-sexualize Harley Quinn. Then they retook Harley Quinn in Birds of Prey, where they gave her more of a character